Hello and welcome to the Autistic Me podcast. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. We begin this new year with a different kind of show. I'm being joined by Samuel Levine, a professor of law and director of the Jewish Law Institute at Touro Law Center, which is part of the Touro College and University system. The college and university system is dedicated to maintaining the Jewish heritage and traditions. It's really a scholarly set of institutions that help maintain a connection to that heritage and continue it into the future. The reason I asked Dr. Levine to join me is he has written a book, Was Yosef on the Spectrum? Understanding Joseph Through Torah, Midrash, and Classical Jewish Sources. Well, I'm interested in so much of what his career has encompassed. It is that title that captured my attention. Dr. Levine, you are a distinguished professor of law. You have taught at Michigan State University, Pepperdine, Fordham, St. John's University, and now you're the director of Jewish Law Institute and professor of law at Touro College.
Thank you, yes.
Okay, I want to give you credit for all of that work. You are also a graduate with honors from Columbia University.
I am, thank you.
I am always humbled to have someone so much smarter than me on the podcast.
Very kind of you to say and very kind of you to have me on your show.
Was Joseph on the spectrum? The first question is, why would you ask if someone's on the autism spectrum from all that time ago?
Why would you ask? It's a great question. And the way I came at this book or toward this book builds on the years of study I've done, both in the areas of autism and disability rights. And that's part of my work at Touro Law School. I have initiated a program that I call the Disability Rights and Inclusion Project, where we explore various disabilities, among them, and perhaps chiefly among them, autism. And I'm particularly interested, for both personal and professional reasons, in autism in contemporary times. At the same time, I've studied, read, thought about the story of Joseph for years. I can say for decades. It's a story that from the time I was in school, we used to study it in school. In the synagogue, I would hear the story read every year. And there are various puzzling aspects of this story. I'm not sure how familiar your listeners are with the story, but the broad outlines, the broad contours of the story are familiar to many of us in the United States for a variety of reasons. We might have seen or heard about the Broadway play, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, as it's called. We may have seen the DreamWorks animation about Joseph, Prince of Dreams, I think it's called, or King of Dreams. We may have read some of the novels over the years, presenting different versions of the story. And when it comes to the United States, certainly, and throughout the world, members of different religious traditions may very well be familiar with the story of Joseph, son of Jacob, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who gave forth to the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes who developed into the nation of Israel. So it's a story that many of us are familiar with from different sources. If we look closely at the story, and in my case, studying the story textually in the biblical text, in the Torah, which is my tradition, in the original Hebrew, there are aspects of the story that are quite puzzling. Joseph has these dreams. He tells his brothers these dreams, which indicate, in no uncertain terms, that he has these visions, perhaps even ambitions, of ruling over them. His brothers don't want to hear that, not surprisingly. His brothers get upset at him, and yet he tells them the further dreams, reinforcing that point, that he has these visions, these dreams, perhaps ambitions of ruling over them. In other ways, Joseph starts off at the outset, in the early verses in this biblical text. Joseph is seen as being different from his brothers, as being marginalized from his brothers, at the same time being the favorite in many ways, being loved more so than his brothers by their father Jacob. The brothers' jealousy ultimately leads them to nearly kill Joseph, so it seems, to sell him to slavery into Egypt, where this remarkable turn of events, one thing leads to another. He's actually promoted in Egypt, then he's placed in prison in Egypt, then he once again is promoted and ultimately is brought before Pharaoh. Pharaoh himself has these dreams. Joseph, the dreamer, is also a remarkable interpreter of dreams. He interprets Pharaoh's very unusual dreams, which no one else in the kingdom has the ability to understand, to foretell both years of feast and then years of famine. he describes and prescribes to Pharaoh ways in which the kingdom can respond and proactively prepare for the years of famine through the years of feast that would precede the famine. As a result, he is appointed the Viceroy of Egypt. He saves the Egyptian empire, the surrounding lands. His brothers who are back in the land of Canaan at this point have to return. Or I should say they have to reconnect, not knowing who Joseph is, not knowing what has happened to him. They have to reconnect with him because they have to come to Egypt to find food for themselves. They're part of the area of famine that's included in the surrounding lands of Egypt, where Joseph ultimately reveals himself. And there's a measure of reconciliation at the end where Joseph forgives his brothers for what they've done. So many parts of the story raise serious questions. For example, at the most basic level, perhaps, why is it that Joseph tells his brothers his dreams when the text tells us that they didn't like him, that they were jealous of him, that he's already been somewhat marginalized and isolated from his brothers? And why is it when they tell him we don't want to hear this, they scoff at him? They say, what, are you going to rule over us? And yet, when he has further dreams about that suggest that he's going to rule over them eventually, which of course ends up being the case, he tells them again. And the original text, the biblical text, emphasizes his enthusiasm, his desire to have them listen. He says, please listen to what I'm going to tell you. I had this amazing dream. And it struck me for many years. Why is it that Joseph doesn't understand? How can it be that Joseph, who has all these talents as well, as he demonstrates both to his father Jacob, and we can talk about that, and as he demonstrates to Pharaoh ultimately, how can it be that he doesn't realize that it's not a good idea, A, to tell his brothers of his dreams in the first place, and B, to persist and insist on telling them about these visions he has? And it struck me that, well, maybe if we look at the story through the lens of autism, that might help answer that particular question, because it's not uncommon for individuals on the autism spectrum to not be able to read those social cues, to not quite understand that if they tell someone something, even if what they're describing is accurate, even if what they're saying is true, and there's this dedication and connection to the truth that we see in Joseph that's common among individuals on the autism spectrum, where he is telling his brother something that he knows to be correct and is borne out ultimately, but he doesn't communicate it in the right way. He communicates in a way that's not socially acceptable, not socially inappropriate, and then in a way that they don't want to hear. And it's an interest that he has, again, common among autistic individuals who have a particular area of interest that they're driven to, that they have a desire for, that they have this drive to tell others about, when others might be saying, I don't want to hear it. I'm not interested. You're really good at that? You think this type of technology is really cool? You think cars are terrific? You want to explain to me how they work? I don't want to know. And yet, and this happens among children, this happens among autistic adults, where they'll continue and persist to tell of these particular interests they have, somehow lacking that awareness, that social awareness of the lack of regard, of the lack of interest among the listener. So maybe that's what's going on. So that was a thought I had, and I further explored the story and the broad arc of the story. And in addition, I looked at biblical commentators. And here's where, in the Jewish tradition, there's thousands of years of commentary. Because if we look at the biblical text itself, on its face, and I'm a law professor, as you mentioned, and we lawyers know, and you may know as well, and your listeners may know, if you look at the Constitution, for example, or if you look at statutes, at certain laws that are on the books, there's the text itself, and then there's the interpretations and the applications. So there's thousands of years of biblical interpretation where we look at the story in the text of the Torah, in the text of the Bible, and Jewish commentators spanning thousands of years and geographical areas around the world have added glosses, have added deeper methods of understanding what's going on behind the scenes. The same way we might look at Shakespeare or other forms of literary interpretation. And what I found was that many of these additional interpretations ended up reinforcing this notion, ended up reaffirming the possibility. And as you know, as you mentioned, the title of my book is Was Yosef on the Spectrum? ? Because, of course, we don't know. We'll never know. I would never diagnose anyone. I'm not a clinician, and I certainly wouldn't diagnose someone if they were in front of me and someone who lived thousands of years ago I've never met. But what we do see is this pattern of behaviors, of interactions, of personal relationships that Joseph has with others that very much are consistent with our modern observations and understandings of individuals on the autism spectrum.
For those who are not from the Jewish background, in the Christian text, we are talking about Genesis 37.
Exactly right. Mm-hmm.
So this is the story of Jacob. Jacob has the 12 sons. They are not all full sons. They're half brothers.
Exactly right. He had 4. Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of distrust. There's a lot of dislike for Joseph. As you said, it's depicted that Jacob seems to favor him, seems to take him under his wing, as it were, as the favored son. And so this jealousy leads to a familial persecution even. So his outsider status starts early. And that's also something we see with many autistic children is early on, the siblings and the friends notice something is different. So you point out that early on in his life, his family, his half-brothers, see him as a different type of person?
Very much so. And to your point of the different brothers and the different mothers they had, Jacob actually had 4 wives that he had children with. And there's a certain degree of status among the wives. And Joseph's actually pictured, interestingly, among those who are not quite of the highest status among the brothers. You may be familiar with Judah. He's one of the leaders, we can say, among the brothers. His mother was the first wife of Jacob, and he certainly takes a leadership role throughout the story and throughout the text, throughout Genesis at this point in the story. Joseph's with the other brothers, with the kind of lesser brothers, as it were, the brothers who don't have that degree of status. And that suggested to me, and I found sources, again, in biblical commentators reinforcing this notion, that somehow he had initially been marginalized by the popular kids, as it were. And I think, again, the contemporary analogies are very clear, are very direct, where you have individuals on the autism spectrum, as you mentioned, children who are often marginalized, isolated from very early on because they are different. What I found fascinating about the dynamic between Jacob and their father and Joseph, and Jacob's love for Joseph, was here too a very close reading of the text, but one that I think with just a bit of nuance tells a lot about what's going on here. Joseph is described as a nar, which is the biblical word for a young child, a lad, and he's 17 years old, the text tells us. And biblical commentators raise the question, wait, if he's 17 years old, the word na'ar doesn't quite fit, because 17 years old, even in contemporary times and certainly in ancient times, a 17-year-old was an adult. We didn't have the sense of a teenager still being a kid. So why does the Torah, why does the biblical text use the word na'ar? And the suggestion that was made for thousands of years is that he engaged in behaviors that seemed childish or childlike. And some of the examples that are suggested is he kind of curled his hair, he kind of tended to his eyes, he kicked his heels up. And I thought about these types of behaviors. And to me, that evoked a sense of self-stimulatory behaviors that we often find among children on the autism spectrum. So perhaps that's what's going on, that he was 17 years old, but he acted in a way that his brothers, and it says that he was a na'ar to his brothers specifically, his brothers saw him as kind of immature, kind of different, kind of engaging in behaviors that they considered to be odd, that they considered to be unusual, and contributed to that marginalization, to that isolation. And yet, at the same time, he's also described as a ben zikunim to his father Jacob. Now, zikunim means old. Now, is he young or is he old? Which is it? And there are those who suggest that he was old in the sense of being wise beyond his years. He had the wisdom of an older person, and that's why Jacob loved him. He was a ben zikunim. He was an older thinking individual in the eyes of his father. So now we have this interesting seeming contradiction. Was he old or was he young? And to me, looking at the story through the lens of autism resolves that contradiction, because there really is no contradiction. These types of characteristics are often found at once in autistic children who may have a degree of wisdom beyond their years, who may be a bit precocious, who may be intellectually advanced. And maybe for that reason, Jacob loved him, because Jacob saw, look what my son can do. Look at these skills. But when it comes to peers, and we find this among adults who sometimes can compensate for the behaviors that the peers might not be willing to accept, who might be willing to accommodate for some of the needs that an autistic child has, to try to bring out the talents, to try to appreciate the skills that they have, as opposed to, unfortunately, all too often, the child's peers who don't have that sense of being accommodating, who don't have that sense of compensating. They see a child acting in a way that they consider, quote unquote, weird or odd. And as far as they're concerned, they don't want to have anything to do with the child. So I saw that dynamic playing out in these biblical texts and the biblical commentators.
The brothers take the extreme step, though, of trying to remove Joseph from the family. They literally try to kill him, depending on your reading. And then he is shipped off to Egypt. How does that dynamic play out? For those unfamiliar with this, Genesis is very short, very, very surface, but there is that traditional scholarship that is behind it that gives you deeper understanding. So is there a deeper understanding in the Jewish tradition of why the brothers turn on him so virulently, so violently?
Well, there's one more piece still in those early verses about Joseph's behaviors that, once again, I think we can maybe, the subtitle of my book is Understanding Joseph, because I think that is, my goal in writing the book. And I think that's something that our contemporary society needs, to understand someone, if he was indeed on the autism spectrum. But at the same time, I think we should try to understand as best as we can why people reacted a certain way to him. It comes of their lack of understanding him. And there's one more piece in those early verses. We're told that Joseph, in a sense, tattles on his brothers. He brings some sort of bad reports to their father Jacob. And the question is, what exactly was he telling their father? What did they do? Did they do something really bad? And Joseph's just bringing that information to their father? Or was Joseph perhaps making something up, in which case he would understand that they would be very upset at him for telling on their father? And there's a fascinating commentary that suggests that what was going on is that, in a sense, they're both right, in a sense, they're both wrong. Meaning that their brothers were engaged in conduct that, under the strict letter of the law, was okay. They kind of found a loophole in the law. And, as a law professor, I know all about that. I was a prosecutor. I know how, individuals find loopholes, and that's the job of a criminal defense attorney, and that's the job of lawyers. But Joseph had a different sense of morality. Joseph's view was, you know what, you found a loophole, you found a technicality, I don't buy it. We all know what you're doing is wrong, and I'm going to tell our father, because I have to inform my father of your wrongful conduct. Now, here we find, once again, a fascinating analog to contemporary times, where you'll have a child who's autistic among, let's say, classmates, and they're up to some mischief, let's say. Not necessarily directed at the child. The brothers do, and of course, as you know, they treat Joseph himself directly, in horrible ways. But at this point, it doesn't seem that these behaviors relate to Joseph in any way. They're just doing something that's a bit underhanded, that's a bit not quite improper, not quite breaking the rules, but they're getting around the rules in a way that just doesn't fit with Joseph's sense of truth and morality. So he goes ahead and tells their father about what they're doing. Now, why does he feel this compulsion to tell their father? They're not bothering him at this moment. And here, too, we find in contemporary times among children and adults on the autism spectrum, this need for justice, this need for fairness, this need to share their view of things being wrong, right or wrong. And in this case, Joseph felt that he just had to tell their father about what the brothers were doing. Now, from their perspective, why are you tattling on us? It would be one thing if we were doing something that was per se improper, And that would be bad enough. No one likes a tattletale. But in this case, we were doing something that was okay, and yet you're telling our father that we did something wrong? And that might have contributed to this sense of animosity the brothers had toward Joseph. There's a number of different components to it. And as you mentioned, it develops in a very extreme way. But here, too, there's one more analog that I did not mention in the book. Maybe I'm taking it a bit too far, and I was careful to ground my suggestions, my analogies to events of thousands of years ago to contemporary times, to make sure there was textual support for it, to make sure there was some support in the commentaries and in what we find in contemporary autistic communities. But it struck me that we often hear about forms of restraint, these horrible forms of restraint, when it comes to autistic children in particular. And here we had the brothers restraining Joseph. So that reminded me, once again, of some of the extremes to which, and we can say, well, that was then, but this is now. But, we still have long ways to go in terms of how we interact and understand autistic children and adults.
His arrival in Egypt is, depending on how you read it, it's the result of being sold, bartered, traded. There's the old question, who sold Joseph? How does this journey affect him?
That's a great question. What we do see is, and you're exactly right, there is a bit of mystery, a bit of ambiguity as to who sells Joseph to whom, who actually brings him to Egypt. What we do know is that once he arrives in Egypt, he is truly a stranger in a strange land. And as much as he tries to adapt to this new setting that he's in, he is able to often succeed using those skills he has. Perhaps it's that intellectual capacity that his father Jacob may have seen in him. Perhaps, and clearly textually and theologically, the hand of God is at play and certainly supporting Joseph in his actions. But in addition to all that, there's this commitment to his sense of morality. There's his commitment to truth, to justice, to doing the right thing, which gets him in trouble because, among other things, after his initial success in Egypt, he's appointed to a position of authority, and his boss, who's a very high minister in the Egyptian kingdom, essentially trusts him implicitly, notwithstanding the fact that his boss's wife, the wife of Potiphar, tries to seduce and more so propositions Joseph day after day. And Joseph, here too, remarkably, we're talking about the current Me Too situation kind of in reverse. We have the person in position of authority. She's his boss's wife. She's a very powerful political figure from everything we can tell. And she repeatedly, day after day, propositions Joseph. She pressures him, and yet he withstands her advances. And of course, she falsely accuses him altogether of having attacked her. And he remains true to his morality. He remains true, as he tells her, to his God, the God of the Hebrews, who, by the way, at this point, from everything we can tell, talked about anti-Semitism in contemporary times. From everything we can tell, there was this great animosity toward the Hebrews among the Egyptians, certainly among the Egyptian royalty and nobility. And yet, he feels committed and expresses and maintains his commitment to the Hebrew God and tells her that he's not going to withstand, he is going to withstand, he's not going to give in to her temptations, and that lands him in prison once again. So we see this pattern of Joseph through his commitment to truth, through his commitment to saying truthful statements, but not always knowing how to navigate the social setting in which he's making those statements. In fact, when he's propositioned and that fateful day, when she essentially, wife of Potiphar, essentially attacks him and he withstands her advances, in an interesting way, she's manufactured the entire situation. She seems to be very clever in the way she, as the text describes, there's no one else in the building that day. There's no one else in the house that day. And the question arises, where did everyone go? And biblical commentators suggest that it was a day where there was something big going on somewhere else, so they were the only ones there. And it raises the question, didn't Joseph know? Wasn't he aware of the trap he was walking into? And here too, the answer seems to be he either wasn't aware, which is, again, somewhat consistent with autism and not being able to navigate and to sense the social settings and the office politics, as it were, in contemporary times, not understanding just how cunning and how methodical someone might be in taking out their anger or desires toward him, or this commitment he had, because he was going to get the job done. He was going to be true to his master, who told him go to work every day here. And once again, he was going to be true to his commitment to his God, to his family. He remembered his father, the commentators suggest, and the commitment he had to the morality that his father had taught him. And that ends up, once again, acting in his own detriment. His commitment to truth, his inability/unwillingness to compromise with what he knows to be the right thing to do, ends up harming him at the hands of someone who's less understanding, less forgiving, and likely someone who themselves have these plans, have these desires, have these insecurities, whatever it is that's driving people to treat them that way. And that's what we often see tragically among autistic individuals and the way others treat them.
You see a naivete that leads to bullying in workplaces and relationships that this then parallels.
Absolutely.
He is in prison when he gains the attention of Pharaoh. Am I correct in that?
So what happens in prison is another set of dreams. So he's placed in prison with the individuals who themselves had been in Pharaoh's good graces. They had been ministers to Pharaoh as well, but they did something wrong. And they wound up in prison. These are we call them the butler and the baker, as an easy way of describing them. The minister in charge of drinks, alcoholic drinks, presumably, and the minister in charge of baked goods or pastries. And the two of them are in prison with Joseph. Now, how did they get to prison? The text isn't clear on that. Here, too, there are fascinating suggestions among different biblical commentators who suggest that in the case of the butler, for example, who was responsible for the wine, he left a fly in the wine. And as far as Pharaoh is concerned, that's a jailable offense. And the baker left some pebbles in the flour, didn't sift the flour finely enough, so he also ends up in prison, giving us a sense, and I think this is well borne out, of just how demanding, powerful, and dictatorial Pharaoh was as the king of Egypt, where even a minor breach in royal protocol, there's a fly in the wine, there's some pebbles in the bread, that could wind someone in jail, and as it's going to turn out, it's going to cost the baker his life altogether. So Joseph's with these two individuals, and they themselves have dreams. And Joseph, you recall, has had his dreams in the past, and as we previewed, he's going to be able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Well, the way we get from there to there is that they decide to tell Joseph their dreams, and he interprets them. And he interprets them correctly, and he interprets them with such precision that they both have a sense that this person, kid, as it were, knows what he's talking about. And he interprets the butler's dream to suggest, to foretell success. He tells the butler that you are going to be returned to your position of authority. You'll return to the good graces of Pharaoh. And I have some bad news for you, baker. In your case, although the dreams were somewhat similar, there are subtle differences which Joseph understood and was able to interpret to indicate that the baker is going to be killed, going to be executed. When Joseph tells these interpretations to these individuals, they get the sense that this person knows what he's talking about. And in fact, the butler is certainly overjoyed because his dream seems to be indicating that he's going to be returned to the royal court. And Joseph says to him, well, here's what you need to do. When you go back to Pharaoh, I expect you, and the language indicates almost an order. He directs him, go tell Pharaoh tell Pharaoh, I'm here in prison, and I was stolen, I was kidnapped as a Hebrew. I didn't do anything wrong here in Egypt, and here I am as a prisoner, and you should take me out of the prison. Now, from the butler's perspective, let's see how this looks to him. There's a prisoner who's describing to him the dreams. Okay, he seems, quite brilliant, in fact, and quite skilled, at least in dream interpretation. But otherwise, is he about to tell Pharaoh about this person? And listen to what Joseph's ordering him to tell Pharaoh. I didn't do anything wrong. Wait, he's in prison because Pharaoh's minister's wife has accused him, falsely accused him. We know, and he knows. But Pharaoh's not in a position to say, you didn't do anything wrong. That's the last thing Pharaoh wants to hear. So let's put ourselves here in the mind of the butler. He appreciates what Joseph's done for him, perhaps. He sees him as a talented individual. But what are the odds that he's actually going to go ahead and tell Pharaoh, you need to retrieve this person from prison? And take it a step further. The way Joseph communicates, once again, truthful information, accurate, if not brilliant information, is socially problematic. He gives this speech, and here again, the biblical text, looking at the original, depicts a somewhat rambling speech that he's giving to the butler, which, putting ourselves once again in the butler's position, doesn't really lend itself to encouraging him to tell Pharaoh about Joseph. And in fact, as the story continues, then Pharaoh has his dreams. No one in the kingdom knows how to interpret the dreams. The butler, we're told, actually forgets about Joseph initially. And the biblical text suggests that he not only forgets about him sort of passively, he actively forgets, if there is such a thing. He puts him out of his mind. And I'd like to suggest, and there are commentators who make this point, that he was in a sense turned off by Joseph. As wise as Joseph is, and here we see this pattern continuing, as much as he has these skills, this intellectual capacity to succeed in certain ways, he turned his brothers off. He refused, and in some ways enraged, the wife of Potiphar. And here, of all things, he seems to have turned off the butler. Even though he has interpreted his dreams for good, even though he has interpreted his dreams correctly and wisely, the butler, we sense, is somewhat ambivalent, if not torn, between an appreciation for Joseph and his concern. What happens if I bring Joseph before Pharaoh, as he's asking me to do, and Joseph does something wrong? What if he says the wrong thing? We've seen this movie before, and when this happened before, when I allowed a fly to go in the king's drink, I was thrown in prison, and I barely escaped. I mean, just the person who was there with me, who did pretty much the same thing I did, ended up being executed. So the last thing I need is to bring Joseph before Pharaoh, and he says the wrong thing, because I've seen this before. I saw the way he communicated with us, and it was problematic. And that was okay for me, but I can't expect the king of Egypt to forego and forgive that type of behavior. So in a fascinating way, once the dream is brought out before all of Pharaoh's wise men, as they're called, he has these kind of magicians, as they're termed, no one can interpret the dreams throughout all the land. At that point, the butler speaks up. At that point, the butler says, I have to level with you. I was in prison, and there with us, there was someone that knows how to interpret dreams. But what's fascinating about this interaction now between the butler and Pharaoh is when he describes Joseph, he uses 3 Hebrew words with a very coded message. He refers to Joseph as a Hebrew, once again, a derogatory term, certainly among the Egyptian royalty, a slave, certainly not a plus from their perspective, and he uses that same word, na'ar, that same word that we saw earlier to depict Joseph when he was 17, a lad, a child. Now, it's one thing to call a 17-year-old a child, to suggest that their behaviors are somewhat immature or childlike. This is many years later. Joseph's probably 30 years old, and he's still calling him a child? So I'd like to suggest that here too, this is a coded message to Pharaoh. This is the butler telling Pharaoh, okay, I have a recommendation for you. And just imagine if someone asked you, I need a job. I have a job here. Can you suggest any candidates? I've got someone who's really good. They're really good at what you're asking them to do. This person knows how to interpret dreams. This person knows how to write computer code, let's say. But I just want to tell you that they're a little bit unusual in their behaviors. The word na'ar sends that signal to Pharaoh, and in a sense, the butler is hedging his bets. He's kind of saying to Pharaoh, you know what? This guy knows what he's doing. This is the perfect candidate for the job because if you need someone to interpret dreams, he's the one to do it. But I just want to let you know, if he says the wrong thing, if he acts in a way that you find unusual, don't take it out on me. Don't blame me. I'm cautioning you from the outset that you might observe something, some behaviors that for no good reason, should affect your view of this person. But I've experienced myself, and I took it the wrong way when he acted this way with me. And you, Pharaoh, please don't take it the wrong way if he says the wrong thing to you. What's amazing is Pharaoh doesn't flinch. He immediately says, bring him to me. I want to see this person. Take it a step further. Here's the interview, right? So we had the recommendation, and the recommendation was, this person can do the job. This candidate has all the skills you need, but their behaviors are somewhat different from neurotypical behaviors, from what we'd expect of most of our employees, from most of the people we work with. Joseph's brought before Pharaoh, and the first thing Pharaoh says is, so I hear that you're good at interpreting dreams. So this is sort of like the opening of an interview, right? Small talk. Joseph answers, no, not me. God will interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And the biblical commentators note how unusual it is for Joseph to correct Pharaoh, to essentially tell Pharaoh, no, you got it wrong. To answer Pharaoh, this was small talk. This was nice to meet you. How you doing? I hear you're terrific. But from Joseph's perspectives, he doesn't want to have any of that. And again, common among individuals on the spectrum who you can call it a difficulty, a challenge, or you can just call it the way many are, which is they don't want to engage in the small talk. They want to get right down to business. And if Pharaoh says something that's not correct, well, I want to tell you the truth. I want you to be accurate. You think I'm good at interpreting dreams? No, actually, it turns out it's not me. God's going to interpret it. And to say to Pharaoh that God will interpret your dreams, that this Hebrew God, that Pharaoh, as we know, doesn't care for, resents, probably sees as a rival to his own ego. It's the last thing that someone should say to Pharaoh in their own self-interest, but Joseph has that dedication to the truth, dedication to his God, and yet Pharaoh doesn't flinch either. He's not thrown by that. He immediately says, well, whatever. You can almost hear him saying that. He says, here's my dream. He launches into the dream, and now Joseph is right on. As soon as Joseph hears Pharaoh's depiction in the dream, he interprets it. He interprets it so perfectly in a way that's so clear to everyone that Pharaoh realizes right away, you are the person for this job. Now, then Joseph goes further. Not only does he interpret the dream to foretell years of famine and then feast, he tells Pharaoh, and you've got to appoint someone to do all this, to figure out how to, and the commentators note, this is a thinly veiled, if that, self-promotion that Joseph's making to Pharaoh. He's nominating himself for this position of the person who's going to take this job, who's going to save Egypt. Now again, Joseph is the person to do this, but it's not the thing you say to the king of Egypt when you've just been brought out from prison, you've just been brought before the king, you're a Hebrew slave. You don't say, oh, and you should appoint me. He doesn't use those words, but it's clear from the context, and again, commentators look at the language he uses, it's at most thinly veiled, but it seems to be clearly a self-recommendation, I'm the one for this job. And here too, Pharaoh doesn't flinch. Because as far as Pharaoh is concerned, and here's a potential, somewhat ironic lesson for contemporary times in terms of employment for autistic individuals. All Pharaoh cares about, as far as we know, is Pharaoh, is his own power. And he wants the person who can do the job for him. Everything else is secondary. Whether he likes the person, if this person can save Egypt, then that's the one he's going to appoint for the job. So Pharaoh looks the other way in terms of the way Joseph communicates the things he says, and he looks to the content, and he's convinced that this is the person that can help me retain my power. Because if there's a famine in Egypt, then of course the Egyptian empire falls. So the way that he's going to remain in power is to appoint Joseph, and what he does in a kind of fascinating way is he then gives Joseph new clothes to indicate perhaps for Joseph himself and for those surrounding him the sense of respect that they should have for Joseph. He gives him a new name, a very respectful name, and he quote-unquote he provides for him a wife who's from royalty. And commentators suggest that the reason Joseph needs a wife who's from royalty is specifically because of the politics involved. If he's going to be in a position of power now, if he's going to be the Viceroy to Pharaoh, if he's going to be in charge of apportioning the food to all of Egypt and the surrounding areas, well, there are going to be a lot of people out to get him. He's not used to the intrigue, the court intrigue, the office politics. That's the last thing that Joseph knows how to navigate. And here too, whether it's the playground among contemporary autistic children or Joseph with his brothers, or whether it's office politics among contemporary autistic adults, if they do get the job after that interview, and again, that interview, there's a fascinating parallel where many autistic adults, when they're interviewing for a position that they're qualified for, there are so many stories where they say the wrong thing. Not that what they're saying isn't true, to the contrary, what they're saying is exactly true. But when you're interviewing for a position, you're not really supposed to answer the question. It's kind of one of these games we play with when they ask you, so what are your weaknesses? Of course, you're supposed to say, oh, my weaknesses? I'm a perfectionist. I'll get the job done. I'll stay till late at night to get the job done. I'll do other people's jobs for them. That's not a weakness. That's taking a self-promotional statement and framing it as a weakness. The weakness would be, well, I'm not so good at this and then that. Funny you ask, but I just want you to be aware of it. So, unfortunately, our sense of what we value in an interview is interviewing skills. Not necessarily this skill to do the job, the skill to put on a good show, to put on a good interview. And that's exactly what happened with Joseph, where Pharaoh said to him, so I hear you're good at interpreting dreams. And he felt like he had to correct Joseph. He had to be honest and straight and clear. He doesn't want to play the game. Well, once Joseph's in a position of power, if he doesn't have someone, his wife, doesn't have his trusted wife who can protect him from the office politics, well, that's the other side or another side of the challenges we see among autistic adults in contemporary times, where the games that are played at the office, it's almost back to the schoolyard playground, unstructured environments, unwritten rules, assumptions people make, underhanded behaviors, people who are out to get you. And Joseph has not been able to navigate that type of setting, and without someone who's there to help him, to offer the supports, to offer the guidance, it's unlikely he'll be able to survive in that setting as well. So I suggest that Pharaoh has seen this too in his conversations with Joseph, in the things that the butler said to him. And that's why he feels that if he gives Joseph the right structures, the right supports, that Joseph will be able to shine. Joseph will be able to demonstrate the skills that he has. And that's the model that I think we should aspire for in some ways in contemporary times, in providing appropriate structures, accommodations for autistic adults to be able to achieve employment where they'll have the ability to demonstrate their skills.
When you talk about the nature of dialogue between supervisor and employee or interviewer, interviewee. Those are problems for autistics. Obviously, we have a 85% unemployment or underemployment rate in the adult autistic community. Thinking of what you're saying there, I reflect on my own experiences as a professor. One of the things that has come up in evaluations, we really love it when you tell students, I don't know. Boy, that really gets them to investigate. And my reaction there when I'm back with the committee is, no, I really didn't know the answer. And so I thought we could just all look together. There's this idea that you don't tell the truth. So if you told students you didn't know something, you were doing it to put on a show. There's a performative aspect to all jobs. Mm-hmm. And this performative aspect that's expected of us, those of us who are on the autism spectrum, we don't do that performative very well. I could see myself telling someone, I am good at this little tiny niche of academia, but I don't know anything about the law. I don't know anything about, whatever else is out there. I certainly don't pretend to be my wife who's an engineer. I could see then this is a problem if you're navigating this highly structured, royal environment where language is a game. And so the Pharaoh chooses a wife who can navigate that game, much like my wife navigates life for me sometimes and gives me the shoulder to say, don't say that. So it sounds like Pharaoh is choosing a wife who can be that buffer in this land of linguistic games that is the royal life.
I think so. And it's, the royal intrigue that we always talk about. And it's real, and it's real in politics to this day. Not that I'm an insider, but I think we all know enough about the political game. And it is a game, of course. And it is a performance. And no one's going to accuse a politician of being too honest, right? They have to say what they have to say. And that's not the game that autistic individuals are comfortable with. And that's not something that Joseph has ever been comfortable with. If he was good at that, he never would have told his brothers his dreams. If he was good at that, he would have found another way to avoid Potiphar's wife. He would have found a way out. If he was good at that, when he interpreted the dreams to the butler and the baker, he would have interpreted the butler's dream the same way, substantively, but he would have said it differently so that the butler would take a liking to him rather than being a bit suspicious or skeptical or concerned about bringing him to Pharaoh's attention. And once again, when he comes before Pharaoh, the last thing you want to say, just you walk into the interview room and the person says, hey, I hear good things about you. Just imagine the reaction being, well, actually, no, that's not really the way it is. That's not something you say. That's just simply not being part of that game. And Joseph wasn't playing those games.
Moving forward to the return of the brothers to Joseph's life, they are in what is now, I guess, part of southern Israel. They are starving.
Exactly right. And initially, they realize that they have to get food because, as you say, they're in southern Israel, the land of Canaan, and the only place now during the years of famine, the only place that has food is Egypt because Joseph, through his plan, has stored the food in Egypt. So those within Egypt itself and the surrounding lands, and geographically, as you know, we're not talking about a very far distance, people in Canaan have to go down to Egypt as well to go get food. So the brothers, Jacob sends the brothers, and they go down to get the food. But Jacob is nervous about Benjamin, about one of their brothers, the youngest one. Joseph's younger brother, Joseph, was the 11th of the 12 children. And Benjamin is the only remaining son of Rachel. Rachel had the two children, Joseph and Benjamin. And in a way, Rachel was the favored wife, and perhaps therefore another reason that Joseph and his brother might have been the favored sons, and for other reasons as well, perhaps. Jacob is concerned about sending Benjamin. So the other 10 brothers go along, and they come to Egypt, and lo and behold, unbeknownst to them, the person in charge of the food is, of course, long lost Joseph.
Now, do they assume that Joseph is dead?
That's a fair assumption. We don't know for sure. He's certainly not on their radar screen, and he's certainly they never would expect that he would rise to this power. And I think that's another lesson that we may take away, consistent with this theme of Joseph perhaps being on the autism spectrum, where, again, particularly peers might look at someone who as a child is autistic and make the assumption, unfortunately, it's not limited, to peers. Sometimes adults have the same assumption. Oh, you'll never develop. You'll never turn to anything successful. Oh, come on. Look at the way you're behaving. Look at the way you're acting. Look at your inability to read social cues. You have such low expectations of you. And one of the, I consider to be regrettable reactions I received to this thesis, to this suggestion that Joseph was on the autism spectrum, is people saying to me, oh, come on, someone who's autistic would achieve such greatness? And I think that's something that our society, likewise, we've come some ways, but we still have a long ways to go. And that sense of disregard, that sense of low expectations, the sense that, oh, come on, he couldn't achieve such greatness if he was really on the spectrum, is something that I think we still have quite a way to go with.
So the brothers discover Joseph is the Viceroy. How does that go?
So there's a long-term events. Joseph himself devises a plan, and I didn't use this term either in the book itself, but in contemporary terms, Joseph has mastered the ability to mask his autism, I think we might say. The masking where autistic individuals feel compelled to sort of hide who they really are to conform. And Joseph learns to conform. He acts in a way that isn't really true to some of the kinder aspects of his nature. He's actually mean to his brothers. And he manufactures this whole scenario through which they're going to be forced to bring Benjamin to him. There are many, many questions that this part of the story raises, many different theories as to why Joseph acts this way. Many commentators suggest that Joseph's trying to achieve his dreams to come true. His dream was that his brothers and his father will bow down to him, and he wants them all to be there in Egypt and ultimately bow down to him. But I think there's something more subtle here. I think Joseph wants his brothers to understand just what they've done and just who he is on his own terms, and to understand that this child, as they saw him, this unpopular, unusual, different kid, as they used to see him as, can achieve greatness. And they're going to have to go through something themselves. They're going to have to go through some forms of isolation, of confusion, of distress even. And they're going to have to recognize for themselves, what they did was wrong in no uncertain terms. And they're going to realize not only did they act wrongly, improperly with respect to Joseph, but they also got it wrong. They also failed to realize that someone who has engaged in certain behaviors, someone who's different, can actually achieve greatness. And it's only when they realize that, it's only when they start to understand that there's more than meets the eye. There's more to the situation in Egypt. They'd never imagined that Joseph is this person before them who's essentially ruling over Egypt with Pharaoh. But also realize there's more to meet the eye about Joseph himself, about this person that they marginalized, that they wrote off, that they isolated, as you said, that they got rid of, because as far as they're concerned, he's a person of no consequence. Well, he actually is very consequential. He's actually the one who has saved Egypt, and he's actually the one who has saved them and their family through his ability, through his skills, through these talents that they did not recognize, that their father probably recognized, that Pharaoh recognized. And it's only when they start coming to this realization that he reveals himself, that he says, I'm Joseph who you sold. Now, at that point, not surprisingly, they're intimidated. They're fearful. Now, what's he going to do to us? Right? Is he going to take revenge? And that's where Joseph, on the one hand, I wouldn't say he let go of the frustration, of the anger. And I've spoken to many, many autistic individuals who, looking at it from Joseph's perspective, have told me that they similarly have trouble letting go of some of the experiences, some of the trauma that they experience at the hands of others. But at the same time, Joseph does. And that's where the story concludes. It's actually the conclusion of the book of Genesis as a whole. After Jacob does return, or I should say joins the brothers in their return to Egypt and reunites with Joseph, there's a measure of reconciliation at the end, where Joseph, even after Jacob dies, when the brothers are really fearful, because they figure, well, maybe he's not going to take his revenge on us when our father's still alive, but now when they go to bury their father, on the return actually from the burial, they start getting very nervous because they're thinking, is this the moment he's been waiting for? And it's just the opposite. That's the time that he comes to tell them, you know what? This was part of God's plan. And look what we've been able to achieve. And look what I was able to achieve. And you recognize that. And he forgives them. And in the concluding verses in the book of Genesis, we're told that he speaks to their heart. And it's interesting. The text doesn't say exactly what he said to them. But I think that's not the important thing. Speaking to their heart suggests a reconciliation and understanding on both ends, on both sides. And this is where looking at the broad arc of the story and looking at contemporary times as well, where there's this sometimes called the double empathy problem, where it's difficult for autistic people to understand the perceptions of neurotypical people, and it's difficult for neurotypical people to understand autistic people. And I think Joseph's ability to speak to his brothers' hearts suggests that he's now getting them and they are getting him. And for that reason, they're able to conclude on something of a happy ending, so to speak, where he asks them, and he's, of all things, he's one of the younger brothers, but he's going to be the first to die. And he asks them to ensure that he's going to be buried in the land of Israel. And they promise that they will ensure that as well.
This is a bit of history that, looking back on it, we can superimpose what we know about personalities and psychology today, which is, as you said, it's a dangerous endeavor in some ways because we don't know exactly what happened. And yet, when we do this, we do have this ability to look back and say, what if he was neurodiverse? What if he was on the autism spectrum? And these questions do allow us then to at least examine his behaviors and the responses to them through a different lens.
I think that's exactly right. And I think, as much as, and I appreciate your words of caution, and I likewise am careful not to draw any conclusions with any certainty at all. But when we read literature, when we read classic literature, and it can be Shakespeare, it can be Cervantes, it can be ancient Greek literature, the human condition, in my opinion, and human neurotypes don't change. Context changes, culture changes, society changes. But I think that dynamic where you have neurodivergent individuals, where you have neurodiversity within a society, and you have neurotypical individuals acting toward them a certain way, I think that dynamic has been with us from time immemorial. And we can look back at a story that's hundreds of years old or thousands of years old and see those types of dynamics playing out. And once again, from a biblical perspective, and whether you do this theologically or historically or from a literary perspective, we can learn lessons from these stories, whether it's Shakespeare or Cervantes or the biblical text, and certainly from a theological perspective. And of course, the biblical text does have that religious meaning to so much of the world. Maybe this is one of the takeaways that we can draw.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you are interested in disabilities, disability studies, disability law, ethics. How do these stories, how should they influence our treatment of others, both in our cultural norms and in our laws, our self-regulation as a culture?
That's a great question, and I appreciate the way you distinguish between, I think, what you called laws and kind of self-regulation. And part of the value of stories, I think, is that as a lawyer, I'm under no illusions about the limitations of law. And law has its place, without question, and we need these laws on the books. We need the ADA. We need anti-discrimination laws. But what I found fascinating, and part of what sparked my work in this field over the past few years in particular, I organized a symposium where scholars and advocates from around the country, leading experts in disability rights, contributed articles to an issue of the Touro Law Review, the Law Review being the scholarly journal that different law schools published. So here were about 15 to 20 of the leading advocates for disability rights and inclusion who have been doing this work for years, for decades. And this was around the time of the 30th anniversary of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I was very interested to see what would they have to say, what would their reflections be upon where we were and how far we've gone and how far we've gotten so far. And a common theme I saw was actually frustration. It was disappointment that with all the success and all the importance of the ADA, it's only gotten us so far. And a realization and recognition that, again, I think lawyers more than anyone are aware that you can have the law on the books, and that's really important. But until society changes, that self-regulation in terms of the attitudes people have, you're still going to have forms of discrimination. You're still going to have people doing the wrong thing or finding a way around the law. And if someone wants to, for example, and we know this from other areas of civil rights laws, other areas of human rights, that if someone wants to do the wrong thing, they can often find a way. If someone doesn't want to hire an autistic person, they're obviously not going to say, well, the reason I didn't hire them is because they're autistic. They're not even going to say, I didn't like the answers they gave in the interview. They were too honest. That's not an excuse. That's not what they'll say. Something like, well, they weren't a personality fit. Or at work itself, and you mentioned both the unemployment and underemployment, and well put, because the question is, A, are autistic people getting the jobs they should be getting? And the answer there clearly, from everything we can tell, is no. But even when they get the job, are they being promoted, retained? Are they moving up in the company? And that's where the office politics comes again. And if an employer doesn't want someone to move up, or if they want to fire them, it's not that difficult to target that individual. It's, as we all know, it's not that difficult to keep a file on that person and find all the times they were a minute late, or find all the times that they didn't do the assignment exactly as you wanted, and add them up and say, well, I'm not firing you because you're autistic. I'm firing you because I can point out A, B, C, D, E. Now, on the other hand, how many people at the same workplace do all kinds of things that are wrong, and in fact are engaged in wrongful conduct per se, are backbiting, are undermining their employees, are taking a 3-hour lunch and just not getting caught. Things that you won't find. And without stereotyping, it's important to be careful. Every person's different. You know the saying, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So everyone's different, but on the whole, autistic people are not going to be taking a 3-hour lunch and trying to avoid getting caught. They're going to be doing the right thing for the most part. How do we prevent the employers? How do we prevent society from taking unfair advantage? And that's where stories, I think, can go a long way. I think that's where the narrative, the mindset, is as important, if not more important, than the law in the books. And if the story of Joseph is a story that people are familiar with, if it's a story people know, whether it's from church or synagogue, or because they saw the Broadway play, or because they saw the DreamWorks animation, that's the first step. If you can engage someone with a story, with a narrative, with a figure, So this is not some abstract law. This is not just, statutes, regulations on the books. This is a person. And again, it can be a literary figure. But once you've gotten someone to listen, once you've engaged someone, you might open their eyes to the possibility that there can be someone who's on the autism spectrum. There can be someone that, quote unquote, rubs people the wrong way without ascribing fault, one way or the other, who's different from others. Well, you know what? That person might be able to rise to great heights if they're in the right place at the right time, and if the people who have the ability to provide those structures, those supports, so that they can rise to those levels, are willing. And perhaps, like Pharaoh, in their own self-interest, able to see the benefit they will get. One more point about the story that's fascinating. There's a famous, quote-unquote, Technicolor Dreamcoat that gives its name to that Broadway play, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Well, that comes from the early part of the story where Jacob gives Joseph that coat. And whether it was Technicolor or some special fabric, it was somehow an accommodation for Joseph. It was something to make Joseph feel better, perhaps, maybe even to demonstrate his skills. It only led to further resentment on the part of his brothers. And I think what Jacob was trying to do was form some sort of inclusion to promote inclusion of Joseph among his brothers by highlighting some of his skills because he loved Joseph. But unfortunately, the way he did it led to further jealousy on the part of his brothers. And we have to be careful when we do accommodate children in the school setting, for example. We have to be careful to structure it in a way, to design those forms of accommodation in a way that take account of how they'll be perceived by others, that bring the peers into the situation rather than highlighting the differences, not papering over the differences, but incorporating that child or those individuals into the setting in a more organic, more natural way. And of all things, that's what Pharaoh did. Because Pharaoh, who again, I have no reason to assume he loved anyone but Pharaoh, well, Pharaoh wanted Joseph to succeed, and not out of love, out of his own self-interest, he gave Joseph the tools he needed. We mentioned a couple of times the wife that he provided for Joseph, the person he provided to care for him, to be aware of some of these social pitfalls he might face. Again, not because he loved Joseph, but it was a form of inclusion that was done more subtly, more organically, more naturally within the setting where Joseph found himself. And that might be a more effective form of inclusion than singling out and saying, oh, here's something special for you, which might, once again, cause others to resent that child rather than to embrace them.
This is an amazing amount of scholarship and comparative analysis you had to do. Do you think that it brought you closer to the traditions doing this scholarship and writing this work?
Well, first, thank you. Yes, I do. As I worked through the story, and in the time we have, I was able to allude to some of the puzzling aspects of the story, some of the fascinating interactions between Joseph and others, between others on their own terms. I really did turn to the traditions. I looked at the text itself, but as you mentioned, the text only tells you so much, and you really do have to fill in a lot of the story. You have to fill in the blanks of what's not in the text. And I was fascinated by how much I found. And the subtitle of the book, Understanding Joseph Through Torah, that refers to the text, the biblical text, Midrash. And Midrash is the early traditional interpretations to flesh out the story, to take the facts that are depicted and to say, well, what preceded those facts? What exactly was going on here? What else happened that we're not told just from those bare bones descriptions of the events? And as I went through those midrashim, as they're called, and then I continued on through medieval biblical commentators. And as the nation of Israel was exiled throughout different parts of the world, taking with them to each community, to every part, taking with them the text of the Torah, the traditions, and adding further interpretations, further glosses. What I found fascinating is that piecing together some of these traditions, some of which might have been the result of a community that lived in 14th century Spain, some of which might have been the result of a community living in 19th century Eastern Europe. I found a number of these statements that, once again, without definitively stating, and obviously we won't find the language of Joseph was autistic, that's not the language that was used until quite recently, obviously. And we won't find a diagnosis, we won't find the same type of psychological, neurological analysis. But once again, the human condition, in my view, doesn't change all that much. The outer trappings change, but people are people. And we see statements within the tradition, the Jewish tradition, in societies and times throughout Jewish history, throughout millennia, that I see as very consistent with our contemporary understandings of many of the characteristics common among autistic individuals.
I want to thank you, Professor Levine, for joining the Autistic Me podcast. I think it helps people understand the nature of this. It's a work of scholarship, and yet it's also a comparative analysis. It's not definitive in any way. That's the nature of much of what those of us in academia do, is we just ask questions and give a lot of what ifs. I respect that, and I hope that our listeners have enjoyed this discussion and learning from you why we need to ask questions like, was Joseph on the spectrum?
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed the conversation.